All right, folks, good evening. Welcome back. I have a little bit up here with me, as you can see in the background. Um, she's not quite ready for bed yet, and mom is working on her schooling. So, Karis will definitely be with me tonight, and she may come up and wave and say hello momentarily. So, just a little bit more there. All right. But anyway, tonight we're going to be doing Exodus 23 and 24. 24 is rather short. It's kind of the prologue, if you will, to quite a bit of law giving. And so we're going to talk about Moses going up onto the mountain and God talking to him for quite a long time and giving a whole bunch of laws. But there's some interesting things that are going to go on tonight. Remember that these laws, these rules are stemming, number one, out of the kind of the proto Ten Commandments that have already been given. We're going to see those given again, written in stone. But we also have this administrative idea, these problems that Moses was having to deal with, where Jethro came and said, "Look, why are you doing that? Why are you spending so much of your time where you're doing all of this by yourself? You need to get some people to help you with that." And so that's where a lot of these laws come from. They're very practical things, and they're actually kind of things that you would see if you're just beginning a civilization. A lot of it's going to be about private property and theft and things of that accord. So anyway, if you're here and you're watching, if you'd kind of drop a note so I know who all's invited or who's all watching, and I can say hello. I'm going to have my phone up too. There's some functionality here that my phone does that the computer just doesn't, just the different platforms. So you need a what? Wait. There's a pillow right there.
Oh, I'm using this for a table.
Okay, do not go downstairs with mom. Period. Okay, that's the rule. That was the thing if you were going to come up here. So, alright, let's see if I can, there it is. Pull that up and see what's going on with this. Why is this? I don't know. It's being kind of weird now. There it is. Alright, so Brian, welcome aboard. Glad you are here. And I'm sure my folks are watching as well. And then Stephen will join us when he gets a chance, plus whoever else is coming on board. Lester has been joining us here recently too, so glad to have him as well. Alright, so we're going to be reading Exodus 23 and 24 tonight. I'll be reading out of the King James. I have the ESV open for modern English considerations, and I do have access to the Hebrew as needed. And so let us get started. Exodus chapter 23, starting in verse 1. You shall not raise a false report. Put not your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. And this is a rule that actually gets carried over into the New Testament as well. The idea of bearing false witness, or of going to a trial particularly. Remember, we've already had a lot of rules so far since chapter 20 that have talked about going before the judges. And so they're talking now about here, if you are involved in one of these judgments, don't bear false witness, don't raise a false report, don't give false testimony, and don't go in with a group to do that. Don't conspire to give false testimony. That's what this next verse is about. These next few verses, in fact, are about this kind of court case type situation. It says, you shall not follow a multitude to do evil, neither shall you speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment. The ESV here says, you will not fall in with many to do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit siding with the many so as to pervert justice. The idea here is that don't conspire to do evil and to try to subvert justice to gain something, or to hurt somebody or whatever. Do what's right, do what's just. We have our own court system that deals with this. In fact, the way our court system is set up, we have the jury has to be unanimous for guilt to be declared, and it allows the person who's being put on trial to have just that one person. Maybe most of the jury conspires against them and wants to bear false witness, or maybe they're prejudiced against the defendant for some reason, or whatever. But then you have that one righteous person, that one person that wants to do what is right and good. They can completely exonerate an individual who seems to be otherwise facing a really tough jury. So God is, again, protecting the righteous. He's protecting the innocent, and he has very harsh laws, very stern laws. All of this stemming from the idea of don't lie, don't bear false witness, don't be in with the crowd who wants to do evil and pervert justice. So, neither shall you countenance a poor man in his cause, or be partial to a poor man in his cause. And this works both ways. God is saying, don't let the emotional side of things get to you. Okay, here's a guy who maybe stole something, and he's poor, and he gives you a truthful but sob story about how he was just trying to feed his family and whatever. God's saying, don't be lenient on him just because he's poor. Okay? But the other side of that is, don't be biased against him just because he's poor. Don't have some poor guy come in and, oh, well, he's poor, he can't fight the system. Don't get in there and write him off for being poor and have things lean towards the wealthier people. So there's two sides of this, and two ways to look at this, and what God is really wanting is just justice. Reason properly, look at the evidence, go after a court case the way that a court case is supposed to be handled, and that is to look at evidence and judge righteously, judge according to the way things really are, as opposed to judging according to appearance, as 1 Thessalonians 5 talks about, or judging with emotions, or feeling your way through these things. Jeremiah 17:9 says the heart is wicked, who can know it? And to be led by yours. And that's not saying emotions are wrong, but to be led by those, especially when somebody's lives or livelihood is on the line here, that causes major problems. And I think we're seeing that all through our nation, throughout the world right now, in fact, point of fact. So, but reasoning and not showing partiality, not showing bias against or for somebody who is poor is what God has commanded. All right, and then kind of shifting gears here, we're going to get away a little bit from the court cases and just kind of some everyday kind of things here, but another principle that's brought forward into the New Testament: if you meet your enemy's ox or his ass going astray, you shall surely bring it back to him again. So if he has an animal that kind of gets out of the pack or got loose somehow, if it's somebody that you don't really like a whole lot, he's your enemy, so to speak, you're still supposed to do good to him. What does the Sermon on the Mount say? If you do good to your enemy, you'll heap coals of fire on his head. You will actually do more of what you kind of emotionally want to do by being nice and kind and good to a person that you're at odds with, than if you were to just continue to spat by doing evil. You find somebody's ox and you keep it for yourself, you're just fueling the fire, and the enmity increases. But if you do good, you bring back their ox, you bring back their donkey, you bring back their lost sheep or whatever, and you say, hey, these got out, I found them. The guy's going to say, but I'm your enemy. And you return, well, okay, so we're at odds with each other right now. We might consider each other enemy, but still the right thing to do is to bring you back your property. Either he, having a problem within himself, is going to feel awful, or he, seeing you do the right thing, the good thing, and returning his property, might have a change of heart. And that's what we really want to strive for when we're kind to our enemies. We're doing good to them, doing righteousness towards them, even though they are enemies and they probably wouldn't do the same thing to us, we plant that seed where there might be a change of heart. And so this is one of those principles that's hard for us to do emotionally, because we feel anger towards people and we feel they wronged me, and we feel that it's our place to get vengeance against them for doing that wrong. And if you do that, how many stories have been written, how much history has been Hatfield and McCoy kind of thing, where well, they did wrong, well, I'm going to do wrong to them, and then that just makes them pile on, oh, they did wrong to me, and then I do wrong. It just goes back and forth, and building up all of these wrongs that both sides have done to each other, so that you have this blood feud that never goes away. But if you have enemies, the logical thing to do is to do good to them and break the cycle. And so, God's doing it here at the beginning of Israel, and it's a principle that should last all the way through, not just into the first century when the New Testament is written, but throughout humanity. It's just a reasonable way to approach things. So, and then verse 5 is very similar to that. Excuse me. If you see his ass of him that hates you lying under his burden, and wouldest forbear to help him, you shall surely help him. The idea here is, you're walking down the street and you see your enemy's donkey. He's kind of collapsed under the burden. Maybe it's tired, or maybe the burden is too much. You can't just leave him there. You have to actually help the animal. And this goes back to, hey man, I saw your donkey on the side of the road. He looks overburdened and tired. I took the burden off. I helped your animal. Here's your animal. Here's your stuff. Help your enemy out, and see if you can't convert him into a friend. All right, and then jumping back to the idea of the court cases and stuff. And again, most of these are just they're one-off laws, or they're a verse or two that is a particular context. But these are kind of just a list of laws put in an order that looks like it's just as they came up. And Moses is writing these down. And what's interesting about 24 is we're going to talk a lot about Moses beginning to write these things down, talking about the Book of the Covenant and all that. So, verse 6, you shall not wrest the judgment of your poor in his cause. Don't pervert justice just because a guy's poor. Keep far from a false matter, and the innocent and righteous do not kill, for I will not justify the wicked. Again, the ESV might read it a little bit clearer. Keep far from a false charge. Do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. In other words, if the wicked is guilty, but you are taking part in charging somebody who is innocent, then God knows. God is omniscient. He already knows. He's not going to let the wicked get away with it, because he's there. He's taking a personal hand in guiding this nation, and the wicked's not going to get away anyway. And then you're compounding the problem by taking part in the wickedness, by trying to let the innocent go and trying to call for the death of somebody who didn't have anything to do with it. It was innocent, maybe because they were poor or something. And so to continue that thought, and you shall take no gift, for the gift blinds the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. This idea of a gift is a bribe. Don't take gifts. Even if you believe you're this person that can take a gift and not be swayed by it. Maybe somebody's like, you're a judge. Judge, I just wanted to say you're doing a great job. Here is a fruit basket. Thank you very much for that. For just doing your job and doing wonderful. And it might seem innocent at the time, but then, later on you get all these gifts from this person who just wants to thank you for doing your job right, and then they come before you for some reason. And, it's going to be harder for you, again, on the emotional level, to judge that person righteously when they need to have some kind of judgment passed against them. It's going to be hard for you as a judge or as a witness to do that, because they've been so nice to you and they've given you all these gifts. So God's basically saying, just don't do it. In your capacities, that doesn't mean they can't take gifts, but don't take gifts in the capacity as a judge. Don't take gifts and capacity as a witness. Don't let somebody bribe you into perverting righteousness and justice. Okay. And then, of course, we come back to this idea of the stranger or the sojourner in the land. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, seeing you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So God says, anybody that's not of Israel that comes into your land, and they're a foreigner, they want to trade, they want to see what Israel is about or whatever, you do not treat them wickedly. Okay, somebody that's just journeying, just visiting, whatever reason they're there. If they're not there to make war against you or to try to pervert the society, then you treat them kindly, because you were strangers, you were sojourners in Egypt, and you should know what that feels like to be in a foreign land like that. So once again, God providing protection, He's providing for His people, He's about justice and righteousness. All right, so this next section here is a little bit different. It's one that maybe people don't hear about as much growing up, but it's actually very important, because not only is this something that God commanded the Israelites, there is the kind of the agricultural aspect of this, the biology aspect of this, the science aspect that makes a lot of sense, but there's also a historical aspect of this. When we start getting into the sabbatical years, when we get into why was the southern kingdom brought into Babylon for 70 years? Why that number? Why specifically 70 years? And so it's important to understand how this all is interconnected. And one of the great things about that is when all of this is interconnected like this, you start to see how the Bible is a complete whole. It's this tapestry that is woven together in a perfect manner. And when you begin to see that, when you get to that level of your study where you understand how the Bible is just a singular whole, as if written by a singular author instead of 40 different men over 1,600 years or whatever, that's one of the evidences. In fact, I believe it's one of the most powerful evidences for the existence of God, is because no man, I've written on quite a few novels, and I still find, I go back and read some of my old stuff, and I so many inconsistencies, because I just can't keep it all straight. I've been writing since I was in the 6th grade, and I'm a single person, and I can't keep it all straight. But then you have this book that was written, the book of books that was written over 1,600 years by all of these different physical authors, and there's not a single flaw in it anywhere. That it's so woven together perfectly that it's like a single brilliant mind, almost a supernatural mind, wove it together. It's too much evidence. It's just mind-blowing. It's one of the things that I like to lead with when I talk with atheists. You want to talk about evidence of God? Let's talk about God talking to mankind. He wrote it all down. It's there for us, and I will gladly defend the Bible all day long. And it's just one of those great evidences. So, all right. So verse 10, in 6 years you will sow the land and gather in the fruits thereof, but in the 7th year, that's the sabbatical year, you will let it rest and lie still, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field shall eat. So what's going to happen here is that the people who own the land would farm for 6 years, and then on the 7th year, whatever grows, but they don't tend it, they don't plant anything new, they just let it be. And then the people who are poor, they have the opportunity to go in, and that's not to say that the poor only eat every 7 years, but it was an opportunity for them to have a richer bounty than what they might normally have. And then whatever the poor don't gather, the beasts, the wild beasts, can gather. And so there was this idea of rest, a cessation of labor, those kinds of things. Again, hearkening back to the creation of the world, but also the idea of God providing for the poor, and God providing for the beasts of the field. We see this in Matthew chapter 5, Matthew chapter 6, I think it is, where he says He takes care of the birds of the field and the lilies of the field, and they're all of the things that God has made are taken care of. And so here's the lesson in letting the land lie fallow. The bad thing is that the Israelites don't actually do this. for almost 500 years. They don't do this. And because of that, because they didn't do the every seventh year, God kind of racked those up into a cumulative thing. And then for 70 years in Babylon, every year that they were in Babylon represented a Sabbath year, a sabbatical year, where they did not let the land lie fallow. And so those all happened during the 70 years that Babylon had them captive. Those were the sabbatical years all stacked against each other to let the land lie rest the way they were supposed to from the very beginning, because they didn't keep what God said to do. And he talks about that. We'll talk about that eventually if we get there. So, all right, verse 11. But the seventh year thou shalt let it rest and lie still, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field shall eat. In like manner you shall do with your vineyard and your olive yard. 6 days you shall do work, and on the seventh day you shall rest, that your ox and your ass may rest, and the son of your handmaid and the stranger may be refreshed. So there was this rest that was provided for them. And we see here that there's a pointing forward to a period of rest where God is talking in Hebrews chapter 4 about that. I have an article about it if you want to jump ahead and get to that. But you can read Hebrews chapter 4 on my Swordmaster website if you like. But here you have a reminder of the work week, the 6-day work week and the 7th day of rest, which is what this sabbatical year thing is built on. And it's also evidence. Yes, a little bit. Okay, go. So you have this seventh year of rest or whatever, and with that you have evidence that the 6 days of Genesis chapter 1 were literal days. You have this idea that God said, I created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh day, so you're going to work for 6 days and rest on the seventh day. And then based on that, you're going to work the land for 6 years, and on the seventh year you're going to let it rest, because it corresponds to those 7 days of creation. It's literal. Every time these numbers are brought up, we understand them to be literal. These 7 years, these sabbatical years, are not figurative. They aren't this 2 Peter 3 misapplying of some mathematical equation where 1,000 years is a day and a day is 1,000 years or whatever. That none of that is actually ever meant to be applicable as some kind of mathematical equation. Genesis and Exodus are very literal in the way that they are presented. They are the establishing of symbols through the concrete reality of what was happening. The symbols are based on those concrete realities. The symbols themselves are abstract, and these real things that are being talked about now are going to provide a foundation later on for an abstract symbol when we look into the books of like Isaiah and Daniel and Jeremiah and so forth. So these are very, very literal, and so is the creation week. All right, verse 13, and in all things that I have said unto you, be circumspect, and make no mention of the name of other gods, neither let it be heard out of your mouth. So God's saying, pay attention here, and don't even mention the names of other gods. They're not worthy of mention. They're just things that somebody made up. They're less than you. And so he says, don't mention the names of other gods. Don't even say their names. 3 times you shall keep a feast unto me in the year. So here's the feast days now. We're establishing, we're again switching gears. We just have this random thing here seemingly about other gods, but God is reminding them, and I think the flow is as they were encountered by Moses and the judges. But this rule here, God hands down to Moses in the proper time. It says, you're going to keep a feast for me in 3 years. The first of these is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which he's already established. You shall eat unleavened bread 7 days as I have already commanded you in the time appointed of the month of Abib. That was the first of their month. For in it you came out of Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty. Okay, so God is asking them to remember this as a reminder of his providence. He says, I took care of you, I brought you out of Egypt, I gave you food. This is what that is supposed to remind you of, this providing that I've done for you. And the other two are much like that. The second one, verse 16, in the feast of harvest, the first fruits of your labor. So this is when the harvest time, like they plant in the spring, and they're going to begin harvesting some things in probably late summer. I know that a lot of our farmers here in America, they plant 2 sessions of crops or whatever. So the first fruits, the things that the best and the first that come out of their crops, they're going to hold a festival when they begin to harvest things. And then it says and then the second or the third one, the last one, is the feast of Ingathering, which is the end of the year when you have gathered in your labors out of the fields. And so this is at the very end of the year, when the harvest time is done, when they've gathered everything out of their fields that they're going to gather, and it's about winter time, and they're gonna let it lie fallow until it's planting time again. So those are the 3 periods of time. The one in the month of Abib, which was not our January, and I think because of the difference in the 360 days versus the 365, their months moved differently than ours did. But you had the Abib, which was based on the calendar year, and then you had the feast of harvest, which was at the beginning of the harvest period, probably midsummer, and then you had the feast of the Ingathering, which was at the end of autumn, heading towards winter. So those were their 3 feasts. And 3 feasts represents the number 3, of course, represents divinity. See, I looked away from my phone and I see all these people watching, and I'd like to welcome all of you. Tom's, Tracy Niskern, Kimberly, Susan, all of you, glad you're here. Sorry, I'm not used to looking down at my phone anymore. I'm used to just looking at the screen, and I do have my chat box over here aside if somebody says something, but I don't actually see who's watching, who pops up and watches on the computer. I only see it on my phone. So there's some functionality on the phone that's pretty cool. I wish they'd kind of be able to port that over to the computer. But anyway, the number 3 represents divinity, and these are to remind the people that the divine, that God has provided for them. And so that's the importance of the number 3. So you can't really see yourself. So can you see yourself? Oh, yeah. There you are. Wave to everybody. Hello. Alright, go play. Months originally had no name until after the captivity. I don't know that I can agree with that, Brian. I know that they got new names like Nisan and whatever. But this month Abib here, now maybe there were other months that didn't have names. But the month of Abib here is named explicitly. And this was all written, all of the things that Moses wrote here, Genesis through Deuteronomy, was written during the 40 years of wandering, starting pretty much right after they crossed the Red Sea. So, go play. So I don't know that I can agree with that without even looking at some evidence or whatever, because verse 15 uses the name of the month Abib. All right. And so verse 17, tied to this, 3 times in the year, all your males shall appear before Jehovah God. And just kind of a presenting of these men. They were supposed to be the ones that were largely participating in the feast. Doesn't mean the women and the children didn't participate, but there was a responsibility of the men who are or would be heads of households. Yes, ma'am?
Can I tell them something?
What are you going to tell them?
That I'm the queen.
That you're the queen?
Yeah.
Okay. She's going to be queen when she grows up. She just wanted everybody to know. They were supposed to bring their families. They were the ones that were supposed to be responsible for leading the worship and taking part in these festivals and these feast days, because they are a form of worship. All of these things that God is commanding them to do, they're part of their worship. And so this is the indication of that the men shall appear before Jehovah God. When we worship God, we come before God. Um, there's an idea of that carried forward in Job chapters 1 and 2, where we have Job comes before Jehovah to worship him with all of the sons of God. A lot of people think that sons of God phrase there represents angels, but there's no indication of that anywhere in Scripture. The sons of God have always been faithful men. You can see that in First John. Not First John, but the Gospel account of John in chapter 1, verse 14. Verse 12, where it says that to him that believe, he gave the power to become, or the ability to become sons of God. So we're talking about faithful men there. And so they came before God, and then, of course, you have this scene where Satan is walking amongst, he's on the earth. He's certainly not in heaven. Everybody has this wrong idea of Satan getting kicked out of heaven. Satan was never in heaven. He certainly would not have been allowed back in if he had gotten kicked out. So the story of Job is all wrong in a lot of the mythos that's out there. But you have this idea that the males would come before God as an act of worship. And then we talk about some of that worship. 18, you shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread. So when they offer sacrifices, they were not to do that with leavened bread. And then this feast of unleavened bread, they weren't supposed to have any leaven in their houses even for the whole week. And then when they did the sacrifice for Passover, they were not to have anything remain, because that's what they had to do when they were in Egypt, right? They had to eat it all up and then burn anything that they couldn't eat in fire and let nothing remain. And so that carried forward to remind them of what God did for them coming out of Egypt. Then verse 19, the first of the first fruits of your land you shall bring into the house of Jehovah thy God. This idea of the house being first the tabernacle and later the temple. But the first of the first fruits. The idea there of the first in the King James is the best. The things that they harvested at the beginning of the harvest time, they were to find the best out of that and bring that to God for their worship. Now, when they were all just wandering in the wilderness and they had this tabernacle eventually, which they don't have yet, but when they had this, they were all right there. Later on, when the temple was built and they got all spread out, and you even had them traveling all over the area up into Europe and over into Asia and down into Africa and all that, when the Jews got spread throughout all the nations, they were still required to make this trip back and to have these three feasts. And if the Jewish state, if the Jewish theocracy was still around, if it was legitimate the way that they say that it is, because it's not, they would still have to be following these, and they don't. In fact, they can't, because there's no temple for them to do it at. The place where the temple was is essentially a Islamic mosque. So it's very hard for them to follow the law of Moses, even if they're trying to, which they shouldn't anyway, because it's been taken out of the way. So, all right. And then it says, the first of the first fruits of your land you shall bring into the house of Jehovah your God. You shall not see the kid in his mother's milk. In other words, don't boil. If you're going to sacrifice a kid, or if you're going to cook a young goat or a young sheep or a young cow, whatever the animal is, when you cook it, don't do it in its mother's milk. And there's a reason for that, being that there was a reminder there for the honoring of mother and father. There's just something that God has given them in this law to remind them, hey, there needs to be a positive, good relationship here. And if you're cooking in, I'll have to look at that link later, Brian, and I think that goes to the Babylonian names. I think has to do with like the Nisan versus Abib thing, but I'll get into that later after I finish here with the live. So But anyway, they weren't supposed to cook a baby animal in its mother's milk. There was just, God considered that to be a wrong thing. Then it says, "Behold, I send an angel before you to keep you in the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared." Now, this angel, we've already seen multiple times. This idea of the angel being... Gwen, what do you need?
Can I play a parent tell you
No.
James a liar?
No. You need to be in bed reading, please.
Okay.
My kids are highly resistant to going to bed when they're supposed to. But anyway, this angel we're going to see is God himself, but God the Son. So God the Father is who's communicating with Moses here, but this angel that he sends, this messenger that he sends, is the same that we've seen before, the angel of the Lord, who we understand to be the theophany, that is God the Son. It says, "Behold, I send an angel before you to keep you in the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared." So this is going to be a guide. The messenger was going to be a guide. Beware of him, or pay careful attention to him. Obey his voice. Provoke him not, for he will not pardon your sins or pardon your transgressions. For my name is in him. My name is in him. Okay? That is talking about the authority of God being, when we talk about whatsoever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord, Colossians 3:17, we mean by the authority of. The same way we would say stop in the name of the law. That means by the authority of the law. So God's name being in this angel means that this angel speaks with God's authority. Well, there's only one angel, one messenger from God that has ever had his authority, and that is God the Son. And I'm going to keep pointing it out. I told you I'd point this out whenever I saw it. I'm going to keep pointing it out. But the idea that God's authority is in him, not that he has been given it the way that Christ gave authority to the apostles, but that it's in him, it's a part of him. Malak, angel, or agalos in the Greek, could be human or supernatural, and could even be Jesus. When we talk about in 1 Thessalonians 4 that Jesus would return with the voice, with a shout, with the voice of the archangel. There's only one archangel, and Jesus speaks with the voice of the archangel. The idea of Michael being the archangel, one who is like God. There's just so much evidence that points to this idea that the archangel, or that the ultimate messenger from God, is his Son. So that does not mean, like the Jehovah's Witnesses teach, that that Jesus is not God, that he's some kind of a lesser God, or that he is a protrusion from or proceeding out of God in some way. No, God is ultimate in all of his ways. He's omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and that is true of all three members of the Godhead: God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit. I'm not diminishing Christ at all by saying this. I think the Jehovah's Witnesses have it right in saying that Jesus is Michael, that Michael is who he is prior to his incarnation as a man, but they are wrong in saying that he is not God, that he is not on an equal plane with God in power and all of the things that are Godness. So that's where I have the disagreement with them on that. But anyway, they're supposed to obey him. They're not supposed to anger him, because he does not have the power to forgive. And this is very important, because one of the big problems with the Old Testament was there was no forgiveness to be found in the Old Testament. The Old Testament did not provide the means for true forgiveness of sins. That's why they had to do all these sacrifices. They were all pointing forward to the real sacrifice, which was Jesus, which could take away sins. We read that in Hebrews 9 and 10. The blood of bulls and goats could not take away sin. That was the flaw of the law of Moses. And so here is a reference to that. Even though this is God the Son, he will not take away your transgressions. Here, if you disobey him or provoke him, because that's not when he was going to do that. He was going to do that at the cross. All right. Now listen to this. This is key to understanding Israel, to understanding, I guess, a little bit of their psychology or a little bit of their history or whatever. But if you shall indeed obey his voice and do all that I speak, right? So it's the angel's voice, but it's God speaking, because they're one and the same. Then I shall be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel shall go before thee and bring thee into the Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, and I will cut them off. Okay, so who is going to lead them into battle? Now there's an interesting story. If you look in the book of Joshua, there's an interesting story where the Israelites come into the promised land, and as soon as they get there, who do they meet? Well, they meet an angel of the Lord, and they bow down and they worship him, and that angel accepts worship. This person, this being that they meet, accepts worship. No other angel in the entire Bible accepts worship. You look in the book of Revelation, you look in the book of Isaiah, you look in the book of Daniel. These men try to bow down and worship these just normal angels, these like Gabriel-like angels or whatever, these messengers. And every time they're like, no, I'm a servant. Don't worship me. I'm not God. Every time they say, don't do that. But this one that Joshua meets accepts the worship. Why? Because this is the angel that God is sending before them. That is his son. It's Michael. It's the archangel that is God the Son. So, but he's going to go he was going to go before them, and he would bring them victory as long as they obeyed God. And he would cast them out. The word here in the King James is cut them off. In the ESV it says blot them out, and you're going to see that they're going to be driven out of the land for their wickedness. But then he warns them, you shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do after their works. In other words, don't pick up their religion, but you shall utterly overthrow them and quite break down their enemies. So when you go into their land, you completely destroy everything that has to do with their religion. Don't try to grab, maybe don't try to grab an idol because it looks like it's worth something. Destroy it completely. God's going to provide for you. You'll have more than you could ever want with God taking care of you. But if you start grabbing stuff for yourself that God has said don't do that, destroy it, then you're going to pay a price for it. Let's see here. God begs Israel to give up their evil ways, and he will wash them clean as fleece, over and over in the Old Testament. Yes, but when? When will he wash them clean? That's the thing. When we look at the Old Testament, when we look at what the Old Testament was capable of doing, we have examples of faithful men all through the Old Testament. We look at we don't know what happened to Adam and Eve. We're never told, but we're told that Seth was righteous. We're told that Enoch was righteous. We're told that Noah was righteous. We're told that Abraham was righteous. Isaac, Jacob, Moses, all of these people were faithful, righteous people, but their sins could not be actually taken away in their lifetimes. Their sins were always moved forward. There's different ways to talk about it or whatever, but their sins were always kind of rolled forward by the sacrifices that they made. God remembered their faithfulness and counted it for righteousness, but their sins weren't actually forgiven until the blood of Christ was shed and washed away those sins. So that washing clean, making them white as snow or white as the fleece of a pure sheep or whatever, that all was looking forward to Christ and the cross. That was not something that could have actually been accomplished by the Old Testament. The Old Testament did not have the power to save. Again, that's what the book of Hebrews is all about. So, continuing with this venturing into these wicked lands, you shall serve Jehovah your God, and he shall bless your bread and your water. I will take sickness away from the middle of you. So, he says, don't partake in their religions. Don't you destroy everything that pertains to their religion. I will take care of you. I'm going to bless what what you eat, what you drink. You won't ever get sick. And then he says, there shall nothing cast their young nor be barren in your land. In other words, there aren't going to be any miscarriages. No, all the women will have children that want them in their land. They're going to come to term. In other words, everybody was going to be perfectly healthy if they obeyed God. He would provide for them. He would care for them. There would be this supernatural shield that he would set up over them, and they would be so blessed as long as they did not go after these other gods. And it was so important. This was a major, major point for them not to do that. So, yes, thank you, Stephen. That's exactly right. Looking at Isaiah, what is Isaiah looking forward to? The idea of remembering of their sins was done every year when the high priest went in and offered sacrifice for the people. It was remembered every year. And so the point that Isaiah is making is that when Jesus became high priest and he made that sacrifice of himself, then there would be a true forgiveness of sins and there would be no more remembrance of sin. That's an excellent point. Thank you for bringing that out. All right. And so God says, I'm going to bless you in a way that no other nation in the world will be blessed if you obey me. And then he says in verse 27, I will send my fear before you and will destroy all the people to whom you shall come. I will make your enemies turn their backs to thee. That idea of turning their backs to you, they're going to run. The destruction there, the confusion. The King James uses the word destroy. The ESV uses the word confusion. A lot of people are like, well, God just commanded the Israelites to go in and commit genocide on everybody. And that's not really what happened. What he did is he brought war against them and he drove them out of the land. And that's a lot of what we're going to see in these next few verses is the main thrust of what God has the Israelites do is to drive these wicked people out, scatter them, and make them no longer nations and make them no longer have any authority or power in the region. Because he didn't want them corrupted by their false religions, their false gods. And I will send hornets before you, which will drive out the Hivite and the Canaanite and the Hittite from before you. I will not drive them out in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the beasts of the field multiply against thee. So here's an explanation. Sometimes God does things that doesn't really give explanations for. Why is he doing it? Why did God do it that way? Why did it have to be this way? But here, he just lays it out. He says, I could drive them out in a year. I could drive them out in a day, really. He says, but the problem is that if I did that, then you're going to have all this empty land with nobody in it to till it, and it's going to be overrun by beasts. All the land's going to go back to the wild. And so that's not a good idea for me to do it that way. You guys need to grow. You need to expand so that you can fill the land that I'm going to give you, and that you can work the land and it can be a good, rich land for you. I don't want it to be empty. I don't want it to be desolate. And so he says, I will not drive them out before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate or empty, and the beasts of the field multiply against you. By little and little I will drive them out from before you, until you be increased and inherit the land. So they're going to come into this land and inherit the land that God is going to give them, but he's going to do it little by little so that they fill it as they go. And again, very reasonable way to approach this. And then he says, this is what he's going to do. He's going to set up the boundaries of the promised land. I will set your bounds from the Red Sea even unto the Sea of Philistines, and from the desert unto the river, for I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before thee. And we can look at what that means on a map if you like. But from the Red Sea is that second fork. You have the kind of as you come around. I don't know how this is going to appear on the video here, but as you're kind of coming around the Mediterranean Sea, heading out towards Egypt. So here's the Red Sea down here, and you have Egypt over here, and you have the Sinai Peninsula in between those two forks of the Red Sea or whatever. Up above that, along the Mediterranean Sea, is where the Philistine camps were. And so he says, I'm going to, from the bounds of the Red Sea, that's that second fork, all the way up to where the Philistines are, from the desert unto the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River is a huge, huge symbol in the Old Testament prophecies and also in the New Testament when we read, especially in the book of Revelation. The Euphrates River is the northern border of the land of Palestine, the land of Israel. And when we start talking about the Euphrates drying up, or something happening to the Euphrates, or a flood of the Euphrates, or whatever, we're talking about something happening with the northern border. Generally speaking, it was some kind of army marching from the north into Israel. So God says, obey me, I'm going to take care of you, we're going to drive out these guys from before you. So don't make any covenants with these nations that he's naming. He's giving specific names. There are some that are not listed here that they're going to encounter that they do make covenants with, that God allows them to make covenants with, because of prior promises and things that have happened in history from the time of Abraham and so on. But the ones that he names are wicked, holy, truly, throughly, all the way wicked nations. And so he says, make no covenant with them, nor with their gods. You shall not, they shall not dwell in the land, lest they make thee sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. So if you start worshiping their gods and start getting this idea of multiculturalism, really is what this is talking about. If you start just tolerating their evil, you start tolerating their false religion or whatever, it's going to corrupt you. You're not going to convert them, they're going to corrupt you, is what this is about. And I don't want to get too much into it tonight on the multiculturalism, but if you look at Daniel 2 and the toes of iron mixed with miry clay, again, this idea of multiculturalism. In America, we used to be this great melting pot, and we can get into the analogy of where metals come together and they're stronger as alloys, where you get rid of all the weaknesses but you keep all the strengths. America is not a melting pot anymore, we're a mixing pot, and it's a joke. But I'll save that for another night. So I do want to get to chapter 24. It's a fairly short chapter, and I'm going to read kind of chunks of it before I talk about it, because it's just these things that happen, but there's a couple of places where I want to pause and I do want to talk about it. So chapter 24, verse 1, and he said unto Moses, this is God speaking to Moses, come up unto Jehovah, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu. Okay, so those are Aaron's sons, and 70 of the elders of Israel. So just these leaders, these judges, or these guys that have been put in charge, and worship afar off. So they're going to come to the mountain. They're not going to go on the mountain, and they're going to worship there. And Moses alone shall come near Jehovah, but they shall not come nigh, neither shall the people go up with him. So Moses came and told the people all the words of Jehovah and all the judgments, and all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which Jehovah has said we will do. We hear this over and over again. Yeah, everything God said, we're good with that. We're going to do that. Okay? Yeah. Moses wrote all the words of Jehovah and rose up early in the morning and builded an altar under the hill, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. I'm going to go back to that phrase there at the beginning of the verse. Moses wrote all the words of Jehovah. So Moses is now writing these things down. All of the things that he's gotten since Exodus chapter 20, we now have an indication that he started writing these. Okay, so he's been getting all of this information from God, and he starts writing them down. And so we're going to get Genesis, we're going to get Exodus, we're going to get all of these things as we go through the wilderness here. We haven't even reached Jericho and all of the things that going into the Canaanite land, and all the spies being, oh, they're so big, we can't do it, except for Joshua and Caleb. That prompts the 40 years of wonder. We haven't even got to that yet. But Moses is already starting to write all of this down. Brian says, turn tail in my version. Yeah, you're going to cause the nations to turn tail. That's exactly right. And then you said in verse 28, it's a plague. Yeah, the hornets, I agree. There's definitely harkening back to the idea of the plagues there. The plagues that Egypt dealt with, these wicked nations would deal with as well. Thank you for that. All right. But Moses is writing all of this down, and then they build this altar under the hill, or at the base of the hill, and these 12 pillars, one for each tribe. And they sent young men of the children of Israel, which offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen unto Jehovah. And Moses took half of the blood, and he put it into basins, and half of the blood he put on the altars, sprinkled, or I think the ESV says he threw it on the altars. threw against the altar. But he took the book of the covenant. So here's these writings, this book of the covenant, the book of the contract, the book of the promise. This is what we're seeing the beginning of here. The law books, these books of Moses, the Pentateuch. There's a whole bunch of different names for it, but he has this, and it's a scroll. It's on papyrus. It's probably animal skin that it's written on. And so all of the things that he's written down so far, what he does is he reads them so that all of the people that are there can hear. So he reminds them, all right, this is what you're agreeing to. You've already said you're going to do it all. Let me reread it to you just to make sure. And they said, all that Jehovah has said we will do, and be obedient. So they say that. Okay, that's their words. Their actions do not follow. Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, behold the blood of the covenant which Jehovah has made with you concerning all these words. Now understand there, I didn't even think to do that. My phone has been quiet all night. But understand here that covenants are dedicated with blood. That there is this power, this strength in the idea of life, because the life is in the blood, and so the blood is the sealing of a covenant. And so when we have the Old Testament, it's the blood of bulls and goats, which was imperfect, was not capable of taking away sins. It was just the life of animals. But when we have the blood of Jesus, the Son of God, God the Son, then it is perfect. It is capable of taking away sin. And so it is the dedication of a better covenant, a new covenant, a contract that is built on better promises, the book of Hebrews says. And so all of the things of the Old Testament are ready to vanish away. It's an old covenant, according to Hebrews 8, verse 13, and it was ready to vanish away. It was ready to go out of the way completely, because it was the lesser of the two covenants, and now this greater one was going to be dedicated by the blood of Christ. So it's very, very important to understand what all of this blood and sprinkling and what that has to do with covenants and whatever. What does this all mean? Well, it's pointing forward to Christ and this new covenant, this new testament, this new will that is in power now, that came into effect at the death of Christ. It talks about in Hebrews 9, the death of the testator was necessary for this new covenant to come in. And by making the first law old, or calling it old, or calling the first one, or the law of Christ, calling it new, you make the other one old. And when we have an old law is no longer in effect. I've heard it put this way one time: when you have you maybe get pulled over for, it was when you go to the driver's license office and you put a couple of quarters on the desk and say, I'd like a new license, and they say, well, a new license is $16 or $80, depending on, I got a CDL for a while and it was $80 or whatever. And you're like, but no, the law says it's 50 cents. And they look at you funny and they say, well, that was an old law. The new law says it's this. So which one do you have to follow? Do you follow the old law or do you follow the new law? No, you have to follow the new law, because it supersedes and replaces the old law. The old law is now defunct. It had its place, it had its time, it's fulfilled, it's gone out of the way, and is no longer an active law, if you will. So anyway, he sprinkles the blood of the covenant, and he says, behold the blood of the covenant which Jehovah hath made with you concerning all of these words. So in other words, they sealed the deal. And then went up Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. And they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of sapphire stone, and as it were, the body of heavens in his clearness. So they go to the Nadab and Abihu, Aaron, and these 70 elders. They go up to a little bit farther than the people, to the base of the mountain, and they come to a place where only Moses is allowed to go further. And they see up in the mountain these things that represent God. There was fire and thunder and smoke and all of these things. And they come to this kind of paved sidewalk, if you will, and it looks like it's made out of sapphire, and it's absolutely clear, like the clear sky. Like when you have a cloudless sky and it's absolutely blue and beautiful or whatever, they said that this is what it looked like. It looked like it was made of sapphires, and it was so clear it looked like the sky on a clear day. So remember Jesus saying, "Those that ate and drank saw the Lord." You're gonna have to expand on that, Brian. I'm not sure exactly what you're getting at that point. Okay, so and upon the nobles of the children of Israel he laid not his hand. Also they saw God and did eat and drink. Oh, you're saying this verse. I thought you were going back to the book of Hebrews. Yeah. So they saw God, and they were able to eat there at that location, in the sense that they saw, but not seeing God in like the personage. They saw God in the representative, kind of the way that Moses saw the burning bush or the fiery pillar or the cloud. Those were God in their presence, but it wasn't the raw personage of God. And so I think that's what they're seeing. I don't think they're seeing, Moses even says, who can see God and live? And so he gets to see kind of the back of God or whatever, but not his face. And he's able to live, and that he glows for a while from it, and ends up having to wear a veil because it was so bright that he was reflecting that. But we'll get there. We'll get to that point here eventually. All right. Jehovah said, verse 12, and Jehovah said unto Moses, "Come up unto me in the mount, and be there, and I will give you tables of stone." So this is the first time we've heard. Remember, Exodus 20, we've already kind of got the precursors to the Ten Commandments, but they're not written in stone yet. We don't have those tables of stone. But he says, "Come up unto the mountain there, and I will give you tables of stone and a law and commandments which I have written, that you may teach them." Okay, so these tables, and I want you to understand something about these tables of stone. These tables of stone are often depicted as these two tablets with just the Ten Commandments on them. But I want you to pay attention to what... Karis, you're being awfully loud. Can you be a little bit quieter, please? Thank you. But I want you to pay attention to everything that God actually tells Moses while he's up there, because he's not up there for a brief amount of time where God writes like 10 laws and then that's it. He's up there for 40 days and nights, hearing all of the things that God has to say. So he's getting a bulk of information here. All right. So he says, "I'm going to give you tables of stone and a law and a commandments, which I have written, that you may teach them." And Moses rose up, and his minister Joshua, his assistant basically, and Moses went up into the mount of God, and he said unto the elders, "Tarry you here for us until we come again unto you. And behold, Aaron and Hur," those are his two main guys right now, "Aaron and Hur are with you. If any man have any matters to do, let them come to them." So if there's anything they need to judge, any of those things that Moses normally took care of, Aaron and Hur were going to have that responsibility while Moses was gone. Moses went up into the mount, and a cloud covered the mount. So what does a cloud represent? A cloud represents the presence of God. We see that in the pillar of cloud. We see that here on the mountain. We see that in a number of places where judgment is being brought. It's God bringing judgment. But the idea of a cloud, when you see this symbolically here, it's a reality. It's the physical anchor for the symbol. But the symbol is being established that a cloud represents the presence of God. You read in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this, "Behold, I come with the clouds and great power." That was the presence of God coming in the Roman army to destroy the wicked Jews. So, verse 16, "And the glory of Jehovah abode upon Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And the 7th day he called unto Moses out of the midst of the cloud." So Moses goes up there. There's this cloud. For 6 days, this cloud is just there. And then on the 7th day, because again, we harken back to this idea of creation, God finally talks to Moses out of the cloud. All right. Now, that doesn't mean Moses was just up there for 6 days, because pay attention here. It says, "And the sight of the glory of Jehovah was like a devouring fire on the top of the mount in the eyes of the children of Israel." So they see something, I think maybe it was Brian or somebody else that brought it. It was kind of like a volcano that they see up there, this fire. I think it was probably more akin to the pillar of fire that they saw. But there's this idea of the clouds and the fire, and all of these symbols relate to the power and judgment, the justice of God. And when we see fire, the symbol for fire is God's judgment, usually not a good thing for the person on the receiving end of that judgment. So the children of Israel down at the bottom of the mountain, they see all these things, but they don't actually get to see the personage of God. And Moses went into the midst of the cloud and got him up into the mount. And Moses was on the mount 40 days and 40 nights. The number 40 is also very important. That number 40 also represents God presenting judgment, presenting justice. We see the 40 days and 40 nights of the flood, when the rains were coming. Now that doesn't mean the whole flood lasted that long. That's just how long it rained. But there was 40 days of rain. There's 40 years of wilderness. Well, what does the 40 represent? It represents judgment on the earth. And we can get into the numerology a little bit. 4 is the number of the earth. 3 is the number of heaven or divinity. And so you get the number 7, which is all things in creation, heaven, all things in heaven and earth. But the number 4 represents earth. And then you have 10, which represents completeness. And so you have this complete judgment against the earth. For 40 days and 40 nights it rained. For 40 years they wandered in the wilderness. For 40 years the New Testament was being delivered, and judgment against the Jews was being, the wickedness of the Jews was being filled up. Very much like the wickedness of these nations that they were about to drive out was being filled up. So there's an important thing. Yeah, it's a generation. Another thing that's very good, that a 40-year period represented a generation. There's a whole lot wrapped up into these numbers. They're not just arbitrary numbers. They mean something. So Moses is up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, receiving the commandments from God, the law from God, what would be used to judge the people of Israel. And so that's where this idea of 40 days and 40 nights comes from. God plans it out exactly so that the ability to remember is heightened, because he keeps using all of these numbers over and over again. He uses these symbols over and over again, and this is where they're being established. This is where the reality or the concrete version of something is given. And then later on, you'll have people like the Old Testament prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Micah, Zephaniah. All these guys, they appeal to these symbols, or they appeal to these realities and found symbols on them. And that's why those things mean specific things. When you're interpreting the Old Testament and you're interpreting the New Testament, and trying to understand what these symbols mean, you don't just make stuff up. You actually go back and say, all right, well, where does this symbol have its roots? What thing was established in the books of Moses where those things are a reality, and what did it mean at that time? You look at the dream of Joseph about the stars and the sun and the moon and them bowing down to him. Those are symbols of authority. Or you can go back to Genesis chapter 1, where it talks about the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. Those are the establishing of the idea that the sun is the number one authority in the land. The moon is a secondary authority, generally referenced to like the high priest if you're talking about the Jews, and then the stars are like secondary leaders or they're other administrators like the Sanhedrin Council. So these symbols having physical reality here to anchor them, so that the symbols don't just mean whatever you want them to. When you get into the more apocalyptic type language in later books in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. So, all right. Well, I appreciate everybody being here tonight. Went a little bit long, but we're still within an hour. I knew 24 was going to be a little bit short, and I could probably get through it tonight. But I hope you got something out of the lesson. And I really appreciate everybody being here. I really appreciate the participation, helping me to grow, and I hope everybody's getting something out of it. Share the video. It'll be up on YouTube eventually. Subscribe there if you haven't done that already. But we'll see you again probably in a couple of days, because we're doing this thing right now. Heather and I are doing this thing where we're trading off every other night. Trying to get her. We try to get her to stay in bed. She's just not ready to go to bed for herself just yet. But we're trading off nights now, so probably going to be every other night where we do this. breakfast in the evening. So, thanks, Brian. Appreciate it. Y'all have a wonderful night, and we'll see you next time.